Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're looking at something pretty profound, actually. We're stepping back from just one single event or era. Instead, we're trying to understand let's call it the universal language of systemic failure.
Mhm.
When these huge, complex civilizations, ones that look totally solid, just break down, almost all at once. We're
Right.
pulling together sources from all over the place, ancient Near East, empires falling apart centuries later, pre-Columbian America, even economic theory. The goal is to really get at the mechanics of how societies collapse.
Exactly. It's easy to focus on the impressive stuff, right? The monuments, the achievements. But sometimes the most telling thing is how these systems, after surviving for ages, suddenly become incredibly fragile. So our mission today is to kind of pull out those common threads, those recurring weak spots that you see again and again, linking something like the fall of the Inca Empire way later with, say, Neolithic villages being abandoned thousands and thousands of years earlier.
Right, so it's rarely just one thing, not just a single bad harvest or a lost war. It's more like a domino effect.
Yeah.
Things piling up because the foundations, political, environmental, economic, were maybe shakier than they looked.
Precisely. And that's the fragility we want to unpack. We've sort of grouped what we found across the sources into four main areas, four kinds of vulnerabilities that keep popping up. You've got internal politics, basically weaknesses in how things are run. Then there are environmental stresses, demographic shocks, things that push a stress system over the edge. Third, the risks that come with being really interconnected economically. And finally, those big external shocks, invasions, disasters that deliver the final blow.
Okay, that's a great framework. Let's start with that first one, the internal problems, political issues, weak structures. And the sources pointed to this really wild political setup in the Inca Empire, something called the mummy problem.
Yeah, this is structurally fascinating and pretty unique. So, in the Inca world, when the emperor, the Sapa Inca, died, he wasn't just, gone, he was mummified. And his mummy was treated like he was still around, still a divine figure. But here's the kicker politically. His kin group, the Panaca, kept control of all his wealth, his palaces, lands, tribute income, everything.
Wait, so the dead emperor's estate keeps all the assets.
Yeah.
What does the new emperor get? How does he fund his reign or, well, anything?
That's the problem. He gets very little inherited wealth. So the new Sapa Inca is under immense pressure from day one to prove himself, to build his own legacy, and fund his own panaca for when he becomes a mummy. He has to go out and conquer new territories, extract new tribute. It built this relentless engine driving constant aggressive expansion.
Wow. So you don't just have one ruling family consolidating power. You end up with, what, like a dozen mummified emperors or maybe their representatives speaking for them, all still major players, still controlling vast resources.
Exactly. You had almost a dozen of these immortal figures, or their panacas, all competing for influence, wealth, political clout. The analysis we looked at calls it remorse political intrigue, like this complex, branching network of rivalries. Think Medici Florence, but with mummies holding the purse strings.
That sounds incredibly unstable. What happens when a real crisis hits?
Well, that's what we saw. Smallpox arrived, likely ahead of the Spanish conquistadors. And it didn't just hit the general population, it decimated the political elite. The reigning Inca, his chosen heir, gone. And into that power vacuum step all these competing panacas, each backing their own candidate for the throne. It fueled this horrific civil war, which of course was the situation Pizarro and his small band of Spaniards walked into and exploited brilliantly. The internal structure, designed for tension, just shattered under that combined demographic and military shock. One leader, Atahualpa, even raided his rival's mummy's possessions for ransom gold. The system cannibalized itself.
That idea of a fragile chain of command, or maybe loyalty, seems to pop up elsewhere too. It reminds me of some classical political thinking. Machiavelli talked about this, didn't he? The danger when a state tries to become more absolute.
He did, absolutely. Machiavelli pointed out a real weakness when power depends too much on the goodwill of local officials. The magistrates, these appointed governors or bureaucrats, run things locally, but in troubled times, they can actually undermine or even destroy the central government through their own plotting or just refusing to follow orders.
But hang on, wouldn't having local magistrates make things stronger on the ground? Spreading the power out. Why did Machiavelli see that dependence as such a risk, especially in a crisis?
Because it creates this potential failure of centralized trust. When things are calm, everyone pledges loyalty to the prince, They'll die for him, as Machiavelli puts it, when death is far distant. But when a real crisis erupts, when the state needs people to act decisively, the prince suddenly finds that loyalty is thin on the ground. People are used to taking orders from their local magistrate, someone they know. They might not respond to direct orders from a distant prince. So that centralized control breaks down right when it's most needed. Power delegated locally doesn't always translate back to central loyalty under pressure.
Okay, I see. That failure of trust is critical. And this fragility, it seems, goes back even further than organized states, right back to the basics of settling down, forming communities around grain agriculture. Early states were essentially just more complex versions of these.
That's a key point in the sources. Sedentism itself, settling down in one place, wasn't some permanent, stable endpoint. Archaeologists have found hundreds, maybe thousands, of settled sites that were just abandoned. Often we don't even know exactly why.
So just deciding to stay put creates its own risks.
It does, because you concentrate people and resources. Makes you vulnerable. Climate shifts hit harder. Resources nearby get depleted. Disease spreads faster in dense populations. Warfare becomes more impactful. We see this really early on, like during the Younger Dryas Cold period, around 10,500 BCE. They call it the Big Freeze in the sources. Lots of early settlements seem to just disappear then. Shows that environmental dependence right from the start.
And it happens again later, even when farming gets more sophisticated. There was that example of the PPNB collapse, pre-Potter Neolithic B, in the Jordan Valley around 6000 BCE. What was that like before it fell apart?
Oh, the PPNB sites, places like Jericho, Göbekli Tepe connections, these were incredibly advanced for their time, really complex buildings, clear social structures, specialized crafts, a huge investment in being settled. But then, quite suddenly, around 6000 BCE, many of these major sites are just abandoned completely. And the research suggests it wasn't one single thing. It looks like a combination, a pileup. Maybe climate change leading to drought, disease ripping through dense villages, soil getting exhausted from farming, maybe just too many people for the land to support. The point is, these early complex societies built on agriculture were inheriting and even amplifying these deep environmental vulnerabilities.
Oh, so even that fundamental step, deciding to farm and stay put, had this built-in potential for collapse. Yeah, that's definitely something to think about today. Okay, so if internal politics and structures are like the slow rot, then environmental problems and population pressures are like pouring gasoline on the fire, right?
Yeah.
Accelerating collapse. The Maya collapse between 800 and 900 AD seems like the textbook case here.
It really is. I mean, the traditional ideas, too many people wearing out the rainforest soils, those are definitely part of the picture. The population density in the Maya heartland during their classic peak around 800 AD was apparently higher than it is even now. They were pushing that ecosystem hard. But the thing that seems to have tipped it from chronic stress into total collapse was drought. Severe, long-lasting drought.
And the evidence for this drought is really solid, right? The sources mentioned multiple independent lines of proof, all pointing the same way.
Yeah, that's what makes it so convincing. It's not just one study. First, you have ethnohistoric accounts, basically, records and stories passed down that talk about famine. Second, scientists found correlations between rainfall patterns in the Yucatan and weather patterns recorded way over in Western Europe, suggesting a big climate shift. Third is the chemistry from lake beds. They analyze oxygen isotopes in the sediment layers. These isotopes tell you about past evaporation rates. Higher rates mean less rainfall, more drought. And they spike right around the time of the collapse.
Okay, and the fourth one sounded really specific, something about titanium levels on the Caribbean seabed.
Yeah.
How does that tell you about drought on land?
It's pretty clever, actually. Titanium is naturally present in rocks and soil. When you have heavy rainfall, rivers wash a lot of eroded sediment, including titanium, out into the sea. So researchers looked at sediment cores from the Caribbean floor. When they found a sharp, sustained drop in the amount of titanium layered down there, it was strong physical evidence for a major decrease in river runoff from the land, which means severe drought. All four of these independent methods point to this massive drought hitting the Maya region precisely when their great cities were declining and being abandoned.
That's incredible convergence. A super complex society built in a really tricky environment gets hit by climate change they couldn't have seen coming or done anything about, and having too many people just made it worse when the rains failed.
And think about how states managed populations back then. The sources suggest many early states were kind of demographically challenged. They needed lots of labor for farming, building armies, but they often had high death rates, disease. Growing the core population wasn't always easy.
So how do they cope? Do they just need everyone to work harder?
Well, sometimes maybe, but that could cause unrest among their own people, their core subjects. A really common strategy, especially for the nasty, dangerous jobs, mining, quarrying, maybe huge construction projects, was to use captives. Slaves, prisoners of war.
Yeah.
Using this forced labor met the manpower needs without alienating their own base population.
Yeah.
But it created this massive internal risk. A large group of people inside the state who were oppressed, potentially hostile, and had no loyalty to the system.
Yeah, that sounds like a ticking time bomb, just waiting for a chance to go off.
It really was. And this loops back to disease again. Disease is the ultimate multiplier of demographic shock. Think smallpox devastating the Inca leadership, or waves of unknown sicknesses hitting those early farming villages like the PPNB. When disease hits a system that's already politically weak or has these internal tensions, it can be absolutely catastrophic. Settled communities, from tiny villages to huge empires, concentrate people, which unfortunately makes them perfect breeding grounds for pathogens and incredibly sensitive to environmental shifts.
Right. Moving on to that third area, you mentioned the fragility that comes from being connected economically. We think of globalization as modern, but trade dependency was a big deal way back, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Take ancient Mesopotamia, the Sumerian and Akkadian civilizations in the Fertile Crescent. Amazing agricultural land, the alluvium, but it lacked key resources. They had no local sources of timber, very few metal ores. So to fuel their society, to make bronze tools and weapons, build temples, support the bureaucracy, they had to import huge amounts of copper, tin, wood, even luxury stuff like lapis lazuli from far away.
So they were totally reliant on these long-distance trade networks just to function. Sounds like a major vulnerability.
It was a practical dependency, yes. But here's where the analysis of their own records gets really interesting. If you look at the cuneiform tablets, the administrative texts, they're overwhelmingly focused on internal stuff, tracking grain harvests, storage, distribution of rations like barley, oil, wool. That's what the state bureaucracy spent most of its time managing. So even though imports like metals were vital, foreign trade seems to have been viewed almost as an extra, an adjunct. The state's core identity and structure were built around managing internal staple goods, which meant when those external trade routes did get disrupted, maybe by conflict or collapse elsewhere, the state wasn't really set up philosophically or structurally to handle the fallout effectively.
That's a fascinating distinction, the practical need versus the state's self-perception. And it contrasts sharply with later examples where trade itself becomes the main arena of competition and potential failure, like the colonial sugar trade.
Exactly. The rivalry between British and French sugar islands in the Caribbean, especially in the late 18th century, is a brutal example of market competition causing systemic collapse. The British planters in places like Jamaica faced what everyone at the time called a greatest disaster. Why? Because the French colony of Saint-Domingue, modern Haiti, was just vastly more efficient at producing sugar.
And the numbers really tell the story there, don't they?
They're staggering. French sugar costs about 20% less to produce and ship than British sugar. And even more critically, the average sugar yield per acre in Saint-Domingue was 5 times higher than in Jamaica, 5 to 1. You just can't compete with that kind of difference long term.
So what happened to the British plantations?
Economic devastation. The sources paint a grim picture by the 1790s. Out of every 100 plantations in Jamaica, something like 23 had been sold off to cover debts, another 12 were basically bankrupt and run by receivers, and 7 had just been abandoned altogether. The market had spoken. The efficiency of the French system essentially destroyed the economic viability of the British one in that sector. Interdependence meant failure could be imported through competition.
And this idea of relying on markets, especially ones that are supposed to regulate themselves, brings us to more modern economic theory and its own warnings about fragility. Karl Polanyi's work.
Right. Polanyi argued that the modern idea of a self-regulating market required something historically unique, separating the economic sphere completely from the political and social spheres. In most older societies, tribal, feudal, the economy was embedded within social relationships, rules, traditions. This separation, he thought, was a radical and potentially dangerous departure.
Dangerous how? Why did he see relying on this separate market as so risky?
Because he saw the self-regulating market itself as fundamentally frail. If society pins its safety, its stability, its people's livelihoods entirely on this market mechanism, what happens when that mechanism breaks down? Which, history shows, it tends to do periodically. Society has basically stripped away its older, maybe less efficient, but more socially embedded safety nets. So when the market fails, the social fallout is catastrophic because there's nothing else holding things together.
And there's that related idea, the optical illusion that economists like Keynes talked about concerning saving and investment. It sounds a bit complicated.
It is a bit, but the core idea is crucial for understanding hidden fragility. Classical economics kind of assumed a smooth connection. People save money, abstain from consuming now, and that money naturally flows into investment, providing for future consumption, like building factories.
Okay, sounds reasonable. Why is that an illusion?
Because the decision to save and the decision to invest are driven by totally different things. People might save more because they're scared about the future, lack confidence, but businesses invest when they are confident, when they see future profits, when interest rates are right. The two decisions aren't automatically linked. You can have a situation where people are saving like mad out of fear, but businesses are also too scared to invest that money.
Ah, so the savings just sit there. They don't translate into jobs or growth.
Exactly. The system looks like it should work, savings are available. But if confidence collapses, the mechanism breaks. Keynes pointed out the awkward possibility that you could have growing wealth, lots of savings piling up, but still be stuck in a situation with high unemployment because the investment engine isn't firing. The illusion is thinking the market automatically connects these things smoothly. That perceived robustness hides a deep vulnerability to psychology, to confidence, to systemic shocks that break that assumed link.
Okay, so we've got the internal weaknesses, the environmental triggers, the shaky economic foundations. The last piece you mentioned is the external shock, the big push that sends a declining system over the cliff. And Constantinople in 1453 is the prime example here.
It's an incredibly well-documented case study of exactly that. It shows how a determined, well-organized external force can just shatter a system already weakened from within. The contrast in preparation is stark. The Ottomans, under Mehmet II, mounted this massive logistical effort, gathering troops from all over, supply trains using camels, building up a fleet, espionage, and crucially, commissioning those enormous bronze cannons specifically designed to break Constantinople's famous walls. They were geared for a final, decisive blow.
And the defenders, the Byzantines.
Desperate. Emperor Constantine, his Genoese commander Giustiniani, they knew they were massively outnumbered and outgunned. The sources suggest after weeks of intense siege, their initial force of maybe 8,000 fighters was down to perhaps 4,000. Trying to defend nearly 12 miles of walls, it was impossibly thinly stretched, and the Ottomans knew exactly where to hit them. Mehmet famously got ships dragged overland into the Golden Horn, bypassing the defensive chain. But the main assault focused on the weakest section of the land walls, the Lycus Valley, where their giant cannons had been pounding away, creating breaches. The accounts described the final defense there. A handful of professional soldiers mixed with terrified citizens, monks drafted into service, people exhausted from weeks of repairs and fighting. Mehmet knew, he told his troops, some towers only had 2 or 3 men left defending them. Overwhelming external force applied right at the point where the internal system, hollowed out by centuries of decline and lack of resources, was weakest. Game over.
And that reinforces another theme that came up, relying on soldiers who aren't really part of your core society. Mercenaries. That seems like a recurring recipe for disaster, too.
Oh, history is full of examples. The sources mention Carthage getting into deep trouble with its own mercenary armies after the First Punic War with Rome. The soldiers they paid to fight for them turned on them. Or Philip of Macedon, hired by the Thebans to lead their army, wins victories for them and then uses that power to take away their freedom. Relying on military force that isn't fundamentally loyal, whose interests aren't tied to the state's survival beyond a paycheck, it's just inherently unstable. It adds another fracture line, especially when you're under pressure from outside.
And finally, when the whole system does collapse under these pressures, it's not just political or economic, is it? There's a deep cultural loss, too. The Maya example again.
Yes, precisely. The sources emphasize the Maya collapse was as much cultural as it was about population decline or abandoned cities. You see a tangible loss of their most complex knowledge systems, their sophisticated understanding of astronomy and mathematics, which they needed for their incredibly complex calendar systems. That knowledge seems to just fade away. You can track it physically. The inscriptions of their long count dates on monuments become less frequent, cruder, and then eventually just stop altogether. It's like the operating system of their civilization crashed. The knowledge infrastructure that defined them couldn't be maintained in the chaos.
Okay, so let's try and pull these threads together. We've seen these same basic patterns play out again and again, across different times, different places. Fragile politics based on weird succession rules or centralized trust issues. Societies totally dependent on a fragile environmental base. Economic systems built on connections that can snap. And then, bang, an external shock hits the weak points.
Right. The big takeaway really is that these major collapses are almost always multi-causal. It's never just one thing. It's that collision, that perfect storm of internal weakness meeting external stress. And ironically, often it's the very complexity and interdependence of these systems that makes them so brittle. One part breaks and it cascades through the whole network.
It's interesting, though, how even in the ruins, people try to rebuild, try to hold on to something. There's that example after Constantinople fell, Mistra.
Yeah, Mistra, this small city in the Peloponnese region of Greece. After the capital, Constantinople, was gone, Mistra had this brief, fairly amazing period. The sources call it an astonishing late flowering of the Byzantine tradition. For a short time, it became this center of art, philosophy, culture, almost like they were trying to recreate a miniature Constantinople, dreaming of reviving the empire. It was this little pocket of intense cultural reconstruction. Of course, it didn't last. The Ottomans eventually took it too. But it shows that very human impulse to relocalize, to rebuild complexity and meaning immediately after a massive systemic failure.
But those local efforts are often just echoes, aren't they? Fragile in themselves. So, stepping back one last time, what's the ultimate lesson here? What should we take away from these ghosts of collapses past when we look at our own world today, our incredibly complex, interconnected global system?
I think we have to take the fragility of interdependent systems really seriously. Think about the parallels. The Inca had wealth locked up by dead rulers. The Maya lost the ability to manage essential information. Are there modern systems we rely on that might be operating under that optical illusion of stability Polanyi warned about? We've built these unbelievably complex networks, global finance, supply chains run by algorithms, increasingly mediated by tech platforms, this idea of the big other collecting data.
Where, as some analysis points out, value is generated almost from nothing, based purely on behavioral data, but the whole thing relies utterly on a stable digital infrastructure that we barely understand.
Exactly. And the more complex and interconnected a system gets, the more potential points of failure there are, especially if those connections aren't transparent or well understood. So the final thought, the provocation for you listening, is maybe this. Think about that tension. Our technology constantly increases complexity and interdependence linking finances, energy grids, information systems globally. But does that very interconnectedness also amplify fragility? What happens if one key part of that network, maybe something built on code few understand, or on global trust that suddenly evaporates, fails? Could it cascade through our system, like these historical examples? That inherent tension between growing complexity and the fragility it creates, that seems to be the constant lesson from history, and maybe the biggest challenge we face now.
A really crucial tension to keep in mind. Thank you for walking us through these patterns of ruin today. It certainly gives you a new lens to look at the world. We hope this deep dive prompts you to think more about the systems we all depend on and maybe question just how stable they really are.